Authorization in Laravel is essential. Let me show you. To demonstrate, I've set up a miniature form. So we have a list of conversations. For each one, we can review the body as well as any replies. Now, before we dig in, let me give you a quick overview. We have two routes set up. /conversations corresponds to this page, but then we can also view a single conversation, like so. All right, let's look at the controller. Controller, again, very simple. Load a view and pass all conversations. Or for a single conversation, load a view, pass the conversation. All right, final step, let's go to the views itself. So for all conversations, we iterate over a collection, and for each one, we spit out the title. And there you go. Now for a single conversation, again, the same thing. So we have the title, who it was written by, as well as the body. There you go. And then a collection of replies, which you can review here. This should all be a recap at this point. Okay, now we have a new job. For any conversation, the creator may choose any reply as the best answer or the best reply. Very similar to what we have on the Laracast form. So think about it. We have to allow for this on the Eloquent and the database end, but then there also needs to be an authorization level, right? We can't allow any person to mark a reply as best. Only the owner or the creator of the thread has permission or is authorized to do that. Let's figure out how. Here's the first step. I'm going to return to my conversations migration, and this is all we have at the moment. But now it sounds like we should record the ID of the reply that is best for the conversation. So let's add a new one here. We'll say table, unsigned big integer, and this will be best reply ID. However, we don't have to choose one, so this field should be nullable. Okay, so now we have a way to associate a particular reply ID with the conversation. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to run PHP Artisan migrate fresh. This will drop all of my tables and rebuild them from scratch, as you see there. Next, I have a little seeder here to quickly whip up my tables again, and the class is called conversation seeder. All right, so now if I switch back, we once again have these fields. However, each conversation now has a best reply ID field. And if I switch to SQL Pro, sure enough, here it is. All right, one last thing. Because we reset my database, once again, I'm going to register myself. And finally, we can see my account right here, number 13. Let's just simulate that I wrote one of these. So we'll say this one right here was written by me. Okay, so now I give it a refresh. This one was written by Eric, and this last one was written by myself. Great. We're going to use that for authorization purposes. So let's go from the outside in. It sounds like when I view a reply, right here, maybe right down here, we'll add a form. And we'll have a button that says best reply. Switch back, refresh, a little ugly. We don't care too much about this, but why don't we say it is a button and no padding. Yep, and then finally text muted, and that's good enough for me. But now we have one problem, as you surely guessed. If I open this tab in a private window, even if I'm only a guest, I still see a form to mark it as a best reply, and I'm not authorized to do that. So how might we conditionally display elements like this? Well, let's kind of make it nice and readable. Let's wrap this within a blade directive. And as it turns out, there's one called can. If the current user can, and let's give it a name like update the conversation. And we'll simplify this a little more in a few moments, and we'll pass that through. All right, so this represents our authorization. If the current user can update the given conversation, only on that condition should we display a form. But now if you think about it, we haven't defined anything with this string. So we don't know what it means to update a conversation. So if I switch back and reload the page, we don't see anything. And that's because there is no authorization defined, so it automatically returns false for everyone. Okay, that's not helpful. So here's how we can change it. I'm going to go into our providers, and you'll see one called Auth Service Provider. Register any authentication and authorization services. Okay, so right down here, we're going to use Laravel's gate class. And think of this, again, very literally. It's sort of like you're creating a gate between the user and some action that they might want to perform. So let's import this. And I'm going to define a new policy of sorts. And we called it update conversation. Okay, so this is going to accept the current authenticated user. And we did pass through the conversation in our example, didn't we? And real quick, just to refresh your memory, we passed through a conversation. So we accept that right here. Okay, so now if I just returns true, again, equally unhelpful, if I switch back, anyone can now see it. Except, however, for guests. Let's go to an incognito tab. All right, so again, notice we're not signed in. However, they don't see it. And that's because when we are performing this authorization, it is assuming that you have a valid authenticated user. And if you don't, it immediately returns false. It's sort of like, okay, well, you have to be signed in. And then if you're signed in, let's proceed to the next step, which is confirming that this condition returns true. However, in some situations, you do want authorization for guests for a number of reasons. So you can make the user optional. Think of this as your way of saying, we want a user, but it's not mandatory. And now if we give it a refresh, even guests can see this. But yeah, it's not overly relevant in this case, so I will bring this back. Okay, so now how can we make this more dynamic? Well, it sounds like we should say, you can update a conversation if it was written by you. So I could say, return if the conversation, and real quick, let me show you. On a conversation model, I do have a relationship between the conversation and the user. So I could say, get the user who wrote the conversation, and if that is the currently authenticated user, then you're good to go. You are authorized. So let's have a look. Give it a refresh. Notice I am the creator of the conversation, so that condition returns true, and I have access to that best reply form. Let's go to one I didn't write. All right, this was written by Anna Marie, and I do not see that button because I didn't create it. Perfect. This is Authorization 101. So again, notice the steps. We defined a new key here, and this can be anything you want. Update reply, update conversation, edit settings, remove user, any key you want. Then you can reference that key in your views using the can directive. Okay, so let's move on because we're not done yet. So yes, we can toggle the display of the button, but that's not stopping anyone from manually submitting a post request to try to mark this themselves, and we can't allow that. So let's set this up. If you submit the form, maybe it'll go to best replies / and then the ID of the reply. This will be reply ID. Again, this URI, it can be anything. It could be conversations / the ID of the conversation / best. Often defining your URI structures takes a little bit of thought, but I'm going to keep it really simple and at the top level. All right, this will submit a post request to that endpoint, and I will pass through our cross-site request forgery token. Okay, that's our next step. Go to our routes file, and we'll say, listen for a post request to best replies / a reply. And now, what action on conversations controller do we load? In these cases, if I can't use one of the standard action names like index, show, create, edit, update, destroy, things like that, I will instead create a new controller and then return to one of those action names. So for example, how about, best replies controller or conversation best reply controller? Whatever makes sense. But notice, because I made the class name for the controller more specific, I can return to a standard store action there. All right, let's create that controller. PHP Artisan, make me a controller. All right. Conversation best reply controller. So now this will hit a store action. It'll accept a reply, like so. And now think about it. What do we do here? Well, first, authorize that the current user has permission to set the best reply for the conversation. If they do, then set it, and then finally redirect back to the conversation page. That's what we're doing here. All right, we can say this authorize update conversation. But now how do we get the conversation because we only have the reply in this case? Well, of course, a reply is connected to a conversation. So I could just say reply conversation, because that's really the thing we are authorizing, not the reply, but the conversation. All right, that's done. We'll test it out in just a moment. Assuming we are authorized to make this request, I can now say reply conversation, and we're going to set the best reply ID equal to the ID of the current reply. And then I can say reply conversation save. Finally, we can redirect back. So I can say return back. And that'll get us started. All right, so let's give this a shot. I will switch back. I'm currently signed in and viewing a thread I created, so I have permission to mark any of these. Let's select Jacqueline's best reply. Now it does redirect back. We're not yet showing the results of that, but if I go to SQL Pro and give it a refresh, you'll notice we did mark the reply with an ID of 8. And that reply is this one here, which corresponds to that. It works. Why don't we change it to Otis? All right, let's go back to conversations. And now that one is the best reply. So now this is working. But real quick, I'll warn you, again, with Laravel and authorization, there's a number of different ways to write it. And I think sometimes it can be a little confusing. So for example, yes, you can use this authorize helper method here. But you'll notice it's also underneath the hood using this gate class, and it's calling authorize. So it's really just a helper around a gate class, which means I could say if gate, and let's import that. If it denies or allows, either one, if it denies an update to the conversation, like so, then in that case, we can handle it. So for example, handle it this way. Often you'll reach for this if you need to specialize how you respond, whether it's a custom redirect or a response. Just know though, when you say this authorize, it's not unique. It's still delegating to that same gate facade. That being said, in my controllers, I almost always stick with the authorize method, unless I need special control over it. So let's try to run this if we are not authorized. So I'm going to go back to a post I didn't write, not that one, maybe this one. Now, at the moment, I can't even see the form, but remember, you can still manually submit those post requests. But let's make it easy on ourselves and simulate it by temporarily removing that directive there. That way anyone can see it. So now I'm going to try to set a best reply on a conversation that I didn't write. I run it. Sorry, unauthorized. It immediately returns a 403. Because if they got to this point, they're probably doing something malicious that they shouldn't. All right, I'm going to bring this back. Okay, so one last thing. Policies. So it may turn out that storing all of your authorization logic in this service provider here, it becomes overwhelming really quickly because it gets so long. Unless you're building a fairly simple application, I think you might instead reach for dedicated policy classes, and that's what I usually do. Have a look. I can run PHP Artisan, and you'll see there is a make command for a policy. This is what we want. Let's review the help. Make me a policy. All right, we need a name, and we can optionally include the model it corresponds to. So make me a policy, and we're going to call this a conversation policy. So think of a policy as a class that encapsulates an authorization policy for a model. So whether you can see the conversation, edit it, update it, view it, all of these things can be contained here. And the model is conversation. Okay, so now the first time I create it, you'll see it'll add a brand new policies directory to your app folder, and you can view it here. Now, because we provided that model flag when we ran the generator, it scaffolds a bunch of methods here that you might want. So again, can the user view any conversation? Can they view a single conversation? Can they create one? So this can be useful. But that being said, often for your models, you may only need one. Do we have permission to work with this model? And in the case of a conversation, that's what we want. So I'm going to remove these, but yeah, do note they're available. And of course, you can create any method you want. You can call this foobar if you want. It doesn't matter. Okay, anyways, I'll get rid of the rest of these. And I think this is all I need at the moment. Determine whether the user can update the conversation. And we already know the logic, right? Return conversation user is the current user. So now we have a conversation policy. Check this out now. I can return to our auth service provider and remove this. We're no longer storing it here. Next, in our main controller, that method name on the policy was called update, right? So now we reference that method name and we pass through the model in question. So again, have a look. Conversation policy. This name here corresponds to this string. We are authorizing an update to the conversation. So behind the scenes, Laravel is creating a map between the conversation model and the corresponding policy. And by default, that's done automatically, but you can manually wire it up yourself as well. When you can, though, try to follow a convention. A conversation model has a conversation policy. So now this method will be called, and we're all set to go. So in general, I'd recommend using policy classes unless your authorization logic is fairly trivial, in which case keep it simple and throw it in that service provider. Now, one last thing. You'll notice I keep reaching for this conversation relationship, and that's fine. It's being loaded and cached, so we're not performing extra database queries each time. But if you want, you could, of course, do something like this. You could, step one, maybe extract a variable for all of them, like that. Of course, that would work. Another option, if I bring this back, would be to, again, create a wrapper for what this logic represents. And in this case, that logic is setting the best answer. So have a look. If I open up our conversation model, let's add a method up here called set best reply. That's going to accept the reply in question. And now I can perform this logic directly on my model rather than the controller. So we would say something like this, best reply ID equals this reply, and then this save. All right, so now I could say reply, conversation, set best reply. Anyways, I will optimize this, and here is what we end up with. The only remaining step is to return to our view, and now we no longer have that string update conversation. Instead, it's called update. All right, so I'm about to let you go, but the only remaining thing is to, of course, reveal to the audience which reply was marked as best. So let's see, for my particular thread or conversation, the reply with an ID of 7 is currently best. And it's this one here, which is Otis. Let's check for it and then display a label of sorts. Why don't we do this up here? Maybe in a little header. I don't know what CSS framework we're using. I'm just going to say inline styles and then justify content to space between. I'm just lining up visually. You don't need to worry about that. So now I could say if the conversation best reply ID equals the ID of the current reply, then within a span tag here, let's give it a green color and we'll say best reply. All right, let's come back, give it a refresh, and there you go. Let's change it. Yep, now that one's working. And now don't forget, for logic like this, if you're going to reach for it in multiple places, maybe that should go on a model as well. Let's go to our reply model, and we could say, well, we're checking if it's best, right? Is it the best one? Well, let's say return this ID. And again, often you'll find yourself doing this, where you're taking conditional logic and you're moving it to the model. Check if the current reply's ID equals its parent's best reply ID. And that returns a Boolean. Okay, so now all of this can be replaced with something a little more readable. If the reply is best, only on that case, or only in that case, do we show the label. And that works as well. So now, as the creator of this thread, I can update the best reply. However, nobody else can. Everyone else will see this. And even if they circumvent the form and try to manually submit it, they're not allowed because they didn't create the thread. So now for homework, consider the example where, yes, the creator of a conversation may update the thread, but obviously the administrator can as well. So we almost need a hook there to say, well, if you're the administrator or the owner of this website, you can do anything you want. Consider that, and then on your own, research how you might implement that into your conversation policy. I promise, it's easy.